As human beings, let me suggest we find it incredibly easy to remain comfortable. We feel very satisfied and secure within our normal settings, situations, and boundaries. As a result, change tends to be, let me change that, change is usually uncertain, and proactive behavior is frequently unnerving. So it's easier to just settle for the normal, to preserve the ordinary, and to maintain the status quo. Well, strange as it may seem, after nearly 40 years wandering in the wilderness, that wonderful wilderness we were talking about just a couple weeks ago, that experience had gotten comfortable for our ancestors. After all, as we looked at it a couple weeks ago, as we concluded the book of Wanderings, Jeremiah 2:2 reminded us that this was Israel's honeymoon with God. Deuteronomy 8, verse 4 and elsewhere reminded us that the very shoes on our feet did not wear out, and we didn't get blisters either. And then Deuteronomy 11 will remind us in coming weeks, we saw all the mighty miracles of God. A wonderful and comfortable place to be. So God spoke quite bluntly to our ancestors at the beginning of Deuteronomy. In effect, he said, move it on out. Move it on out. It's time to move on. It's time to take possession of what I've promised you. So the book begins in the first verses that were read to you this evening by Zach. The Lord our God spoke to us at Erev, another name for Sinai, saying, enough for you. Enough staying at this mountain. Now, as you're well aware, Deuteronomy is entitled Devarim in Hebrew, taken from the opening phrase, Elah Hadvarim, where these are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel. In other words, the last of the 5 books of the Torah comprises a series of speeches that Moses gives to the new generation of Israelites, those who are about to enter the promised land, those who needed the instructions for what to do and how to live once they got there. In a sense, it was marching orders, but that's a whole other perspective we don't have time to develop this evening. So Moses begins with a review of the travels from Sinai to the east bank of the Jordan. That's the part of the Jordan that's on the other side of what is Israel today. And that becomes the setting for the entire book. Interestingly, these opening lines, which are the words that God used to send Israel off from Sinai, or Horeb, are quite striking. And it's also quite striking that they're located here as well. It's almost as if God is saying it all over again. He says, enough for you already. Rav lachem in Hebrew. Enough for you staying at this mountain. Look, we realize full well that Sinai is the holy mountain. It is the place of divine encounter and dramatic experience. It is the place of the giving of the Torah. And understanding that, it might seem a bit abrupt, this command, as if it's almost a rebuke. And the tone continues in the verse which follows. In effect, it says, face about, march on, and come to the Amorite hill country. Now, the plain sense of this particular text indicates that the year that Israel had encamped at Sinai, from God's perspective, was quite long enough. And he says it's time to continue on to the land of Canaan. The great medieval commentator and Rabbi Rashi, however, brings out a further textual meaning based on a midrash, a homiletical explanation of the text, that understands this Hebrew phrase, Rav lachem, as meaning there is much for you. The term is Rav, which is often the term for much. And this is a legitimate understanding of the phrase. So Rashi says, based on that, there is much eminence for you and much reward for your having lived or settled or remained at this mountain. You made the tabernacle, the menorah, and the holy implements. You received the Torah, and you appointed Sanhedrin courts and leaders of tribes. A place of real importance. Now, this understanding of the reading is undoubtedly true. Sinai is the place of great reward. And we reflect that somewhat, too, when we respond at the presentation of the Torah. The Torah is, after all, a grand treasure. And Sinai is the place of an encounter with God that elevated Israel to greatness. The kind of greatness that Israel then could reflect to others, as Deuteronomy 4 tells us. When we follow God's instructions and the nations of the world say, wow, what an impressive people. No, actually, wow, what an impressive God. And a people who's so close to their God. And yet this reading of Rashi's does not exhaust the implications of the phrase Rav Lachem. You see, these very same words were part of that debate between Moses and the supporters of Korah, some several weeks ago that we read about in number 16. And the text there says, they assembled against Moses and against Aaron, and they said to them, to Moses and to Aaron, Rav Lachem, too much is yours. You take too much on yourselves. They say the entire community are holy. Why then do you exalt yourselves over the assembly of the Lord? And so Moses answered at that point this challenge with a challenge of his own. That they should all appear before the Lord with their incense burners in their hands. You remember the story. And there God himself would indicate whom he chooses as holy or as leaders over his community. And Moses, interestingly, concludes his challenge with the same phrase, Rav Lachem, too much, rather, is yours, sons of Levi. You are taking too much upon yourselves. Now, in that setting, the words are a rebuke, which raises the question then, could the phrase then have the same sense in the command given to depart Erev, the mountain, or to move on in the book of Deuteronomy? And if so, for what reason would the Lord be rebuking Israel? He is certainly not minimizing the amazing experience that he brought to them at Sinai. He's not saying to the people, move on from the Torah and all that it contains. That happens in certain, how should we put it, weak theologies. Sinai is the place of unparalleled divine enlightenment and supernatural encounter. It's the place of the very revelation from God and of God that has indelibly defined our character as Israel and as a Jewish people, having shaped Jewish history ever since. And much of the book of Deuteronomy, as we go through it over these next several weeks, reminds us Israel is not to depart from Sinai. In other words, in the sense of not departing from the original revelation that took place there, and from all its guidelines and instructions and ordinances. At the same time, however, the Lord seems to be warning Israel not to settle in on a particular experience with God. But he's saying continue in obedience to fulfill God's purposes. At the end of the book in Deuteronomy 28, he's going to say you really need to follow through on all of God's guidelines so you can get all these great blessings in for 10 verses. He unwraps one blessing after another after another. In the text that Zach read to you tonight, he says, follow through on what God has promised. Take possession of what God has given you. In that case, particularly the land, your calling, your destiny, your mission. Look, we need to acknowledge that a sense of God's special direct presence is an unparalleled reward. But there's always the temptation in the religious journey to camp out, if you would have it, if I might use wilderness terminology, to camp out and settle in at the place of our greatest experience of God. In that case, the experience itself then often can become the center of focus. And when the experience is gone, what do? We seek a repeat, if not an ever-repeating performance of that same experience. For some, therefore, the religious life becomes a desperate search to recapture some old feeling. Or it becomes a search for a dramatic new revelation to match somehow the original one that initiated the journey. Such a temptation may be especially intense for those who have had a very dramatic, life-changing encounter with Yeshua as the living Messiah. The great Rabbi, Rav Shaul, on his way to Damascus to persecute the believers in the synagogues there in Damascus, he had a life-shattering encounter with God himself. And he was thoroughly overwhelmed by this encounter, and he raised some questions, and it's always important to raise questions in this particular kind of situation and in many situations. It's vitally important to ask the right question at the right time and the right place, as the man discovered when he went into the store. And he told the clerk, "I'd like some Italian sausage." And the clerk looked at him and politely said, "Are you from New Jersey?" Now the guy, clearly offended, said, "Well, yes I am. But let me ask you something. If I had asked for German bratwurst, would you ask me if I was German? If I asked for a kosher hot dog, would you ask me if I was Jewish? If I asked you for a taco, would you dare ask me if I was a Mexican? Would you? Huh? Would you?" The clerk was a bit taken aback, as you might suspect, and said, "Well, no." "And if I asked for some Irish whiskey, would you ask if I were Irish? And if I had wanted vodka, would you assume that I was Russian?" "Well, no, I probably wouldn't." And then, with the deepest, most self-righteous indignation he could muster, the customer said, "Well, all right then. Why did you ask me if I'm from Jersey just because I asked for Italian sausage?" To which the clerk softly replied, "Because you're at Home Depot." Yeah, it's important to ask the right questions in the right place. And in this case, Rav Shul actually asked two very important questions. He said, "Who are you, Lord?" As at Sinai, this dramatic encounter was, as he realized, a revelation of God. And Rav Shaul, the great rabbi of old, wanted rightly to properly understand the nature and meaning and significance of this revelation.